Hello, welcome back. We're going to start the second session of the panel called Monumentality and the Technological Sublime. And we're going to move from natural landscapes to industrial landscapes. And the first presentation is going to be given by Rodrigo Booth. I'm going to introduce Rodrigo, who is a historian. He is an associate professor at the architecture department of the University of Chile. He studied his BA in history and PhD in architecture and urban studies at the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile. He was a postdoc researcher at the Université de la Sorbonne Nouvelle Paris in 2011. He has been visiting professor and researcher at the National University of Rosario in Argentina, the École des Hautes Études in San Social in Paris, and National Autonomous University of Mexico, Université de Strasbourg, and the Fondation Maison des Sciences de l'Homme in Paris. His work is dedicated to the study of the cross between the history of technology and the history of architecture and the urban landscape. Having the support of the National Research Council of Chile, Rodrigo has conducted research projects on aspects of the cultural history of technology and has published numerous articles on the history of mobility, history of landscape, infrastructures, and urban history in journals from various countries. He is the author of the book Luis Ladrón de Guevara, Fotografía e Industria en Chile, published in Santiago in 2012. Rodrigo is currently preparing a book dedicated to the history of aesthetic notions of landscape in the Araucanía and Chilean Patagonia between the mid-19th and mid-20th centuries. He is currently director of the Art and Architecture Studies Group of the National Research Council of Chile. Please welcome Rodrigo Booth.
Well, thank you, Cristobal, and thank you, Alexa, and all the Getty team for this invitation. Well, today I will start to talk about dams in a way that we have rarely seen before. The fire of Notre Dame placed the precarious conservation of monuments at the center of international public opinion. The immediate global response was a tidal wave of millions of donations, and opinions were immediately shared by experts and non-experts around the world. Chile's president, for instance, offered his French counterpart, Emmanuel Macron, all the copper and wood that was necessary for the reconstruction of Notre Dame. An interesting debate on monuments, and specifically on ideas concerning traditional monuments, those who have been built by human culture, as well as natural monuments, which are not human-made, occurred in the pages of the newspaper El Mercurio. In a letter to the editor, the architect Juan Lund proposed that the donate wood offered by the president be obtained from native trees. Lund said that, according to the opinion of a French expert that has been cited in the Chilean press, France no longer had any forest with trees that could provide appropriate wood for the pieces needed to rebuild Notre Dame's roof. This architect proposed donating wood from coiwe trees that, according to him, have a straight trunk that reach up to 4 meters in diameter, which can perfectly replace the original oak of the ill-fated cathedral. This comment, presented in a mass media outlet such El Mercurio, generated a debate on Facebook and Twitter between those who defend Chile's participation in the reconstruction of French monuments. You know, nobody cares about Chile's participation in Notre Dame's reconstruction. and those who felt that cutting down endemic, nearly extinct trees that are protected under Chilean law would be a crime against environment. The following day, the University of Chile agronomy professor Álvaro Gutiérrez published a reply entitled "Cutting Down Monuments," in which the scientists critically respond to Lund's proposals, explaining that after measuring more than 650,000 Chilean trees, only about 50 specimens exceed 2.5 meters in diameter, and that only one known leaf specimen was close to 4 meters. In agronomic science, these are considered to be monumental trees and were designated by Gutiérrez as a living natural heritage of global importance. The scientist's letter closed the debate by stating that in Chile, we do not have architectural monuments like Notre Dame, but we do have natural monuments that we must start taking care of. In Chile, the legislation on the conservation of nature is approximately 100 years old. The founding of the first national parks in Araucania and northern Patagonia, which began to be occupied in the mid-19th century, aimed to preserve areas valued for certain scenic qualities that convert them into spaces with a common look and spiritual tonality of the landscape. A Stimmung, in the word of Georg Simmel, that provoke a shared feeling among observers toward natural things. A reform to the national park law made in the mid-1980s under the Pinochet dictatorship gave certain places natural monument status, granting them the importance of evoking nationalistic ideas. As with national parks, most of the natural monuments are in southern Chile and include lakes, lagoons, volcanoes, waterfall, mountains, salt lakes, rock formations, caves, and forests, as well as a limited number of endemic botanic and animal species that have been given the legal status of natural monuments in Chile. In this talk, I would like to take up the scientist's question as to whether it's acceptable to cut down monuments in Chile, presenting two examples of nature considered as a monument that address conflict over the construction of hydroelectric dams on rivers and waterfalls that were once considered to be wonders of nature. The hypothesis that guide this work presuppose that the idea of natural monuments in the relationship between the observer and the observed has changed when that environment ethic have. Here, I refer specifically to the link between indigenous people and the land, and more recently, to the effect of climate change. Both pristine nature and the infrastructure that has transformed it define the idea of the landscape of Araucania and Patagonia through the aesthetic notion of sublime, which refers to that sense of terror and death provoked by a natural object that is menacing and violent, thus emphasizing the smallness of human experience, as it was defined by philosophers such as Edmund Burke and Immanuel Kant in the 18th century. The incorporation of infrastructure into the landscape has been interpreted by the historian David Nye as a new technological sublime that has been imposed on the human experience in relation to the landscape starting in the 19th and 20th century. A consideration of notions surrounding nature and its transformation into a technological object require attention to ethical changes in the relation between people and the natural environment. especially as observed over the last few decades, as the conservation of nature has become a significant issue for contemporary culture in the context of understanding the Anthropocene from a geological and societal perspective. Although the category of natural monument became part of Chilean law in the mid-1980s, many tourist attractions that were established in the late 19th and early 20th century involved the generic idea of natural monument, understood as a large-scale natural object that make an impact on the observer due to their size, sound, or potential danger. They also fall under the category of natural sublime. Among them, the waterfalls and major rivers. In Araucanía, Huaymapu, which is the call that the Mapuche people, the indigenous people, call this place Araucanía, Huaymapu, and Patagonia in southern Chile, precipitation conditions favored the concentration of a large part of freshwater reserve outside the polar circles. It is not uncommon to cross across large rivers there that flow down steep slopes, allowing for the formation of waterfalls of different sizes. These are scenic spaces that were dominated by wild, unexplored nature until the end of the 19th century, when they began to be controlled by the Chilean state. A large part of Chile's indigenous people still lives in this area. The Mapuche people, their name literally translated to people of the earth, have made nature a major part of their worldview. The Villarrica volcano, for example, is known by the Mapuche as Ruca Pillan, that is, the house of Pillan, the most important spirit in Mapuche pantheon. Rivers are interpreted by the Mapuche as the source of life and waterfalls, as a point of connection between the inhabited world on earth and the spirit that rules in the sky. Everything in the Mapuche worldview contains interpretation associated with nature. I would like to concentrate on what happened to Pemmican Falls, which were featured in all the Chilean travel guides as a place that should not be missed by any tourist interested in getting to know the natural wonders of a still wild Chile. The 1920 guide, entitled Turismo en las provincias del sur de Chile, Tourism in Southern Province of Chile, described the area as follows. It is an indescribable feeling that greets the traveler who crosses this dense forest. Suddenly, he finds himself before a panorama unrivaled in its beauty and magnificence in all the Republic. The mighty Pemmican that flows through virgin forest, falling from a height of 30 meters into an abyss whose walls are adorned with the exquisite foliage of innumerable ferns. The Pemmican Falls were located on private property until the mid-1930s. Since the end of the previous decade, the Chilean state had been promoting a tourism policy that was concentrated on the country's south, along the old border with Mapuche territory, as part of the process of the annexing the region and in line with nationalistic ideas that romanticize the southern landscape. In this context, President Arturo Alessandri proposed a bill in 1935 to expropriate the site of the Pemmican Falls to promote tourism. In his message to Congress, the president explained that the National Tourism Service had the authority, quote, to safeguard the conservation of the country's natural wonders, and unquestionably, one of the worthiest candidates for this care and protection is the Pemmican waterfall. The bill was quickly approved. The waterfall becoming a place of public interest administered by the state. This was arranged in accordance with the national policy that promote tourism and the construction of hotels in southern Chile, in Araucanía, Guaymapu, and Lake regions, which, after being named La Frontera, the frontier, in the first decade of 20th century, began to be known informally as the Chilean Switzerland, due to its scenic qualities. Tourism was promoted by the State Railway Company as a way of reorienting its business after freight traffic decline in the wake of the world economic crisis of 1929. The Chilean Switzerland contained a number of glacial lakes, cold rainforest, volcanoes, views of the snow Cape Andes, and, as can be seen in a variety of tourist material, the Pemmican and other falls. But Chile is an ill-starred country. According to the League of Nations reports, Chile's gross domestic product fell by 80% after the crash of the New York Stock Exchange in 1929. The Chilean economy was based on the export of raw materials, especially saltpeter, copper, and wood, and the dramatic drop of the demand of this product on the international market led to the worst economic crisis in the country's history. The Great Depression was felt strongly in this part of South America. Right when the Chilean economy was regaining in strength in January 1939, a major earthquake devastated the most productive area of the country. The Chilean earthquake killed nearly 30,000 people and destroyed much of the economic capacity of central Chile. This socio-natural disaster required a change in Chile's economic development policies. The national enterprises required the supply of the electric power that, until then, the Chilean state had been unable to produce. The first electrical production plan, published in April 1939, 2 months after the earthquake, by the engineer Raúl Simón and endorsed by the national authorities, therefore saw the rivers of southern Chile as a potential source of electricity that could and should be exploited, rather than as natural wonders worthy of conservation. The Pemmican Fall were the first to be incorporated into the 1939 electric production plan. The state owner of the Waterfall, established only 4 years previously to safeguard the conservation of natural wonders, was instead used for an electrification plan that will benefit local industry. Chile lacked coal deposit, and practically all of the country's oil was imported, which made hydroelectricity into the preferred power generation method. In 1940, the National Electric Company, Endesa, was founded. It executed the plans for the construction of hydroelectric plants in Araucanía, Guaymapu, and the northern Chilean Patagonia. That same year, work began on the construction of a power plant on the Pemmican Falls, which involved the construction of a small dam in an artificial reservoir, diverting water to turbines, which were powered by the hydraulic force of the drop to produce 700 kilowatts of power. It's a small dam. This means that the waterfall will dry up, eliminating a major tourist attraction in southern Chile. The Pemmican hydroelectric plant began operations in 1944, and it is part of this system of plants. A promotional brochure published in 1944 as part of the inauguration of the Pemmican hydroelectric plant clearly shows how nature is transformed into a new technological monument through engineered plans, infographics showing electricity used in southern Chile, and photographs of the construction process. The electric company copy-read, I quote, "A house of machinery has been built in the middle of a forest. It has become a true symbol, with vegetation supporting the work of man. That's how electricity is for Chile. Virgin wealth that is just beginning to be discovered. The trees have disappeared and the house of machinery emerged in its place. That steel and those men will give us electricity." During my research process, it has been interesting to note the absence of debate regarding the conservation of nature in Chile, at least until the 1990s, in the process of building hydroelectric plants. Over the nearly 50 years following the 1930s, when the national electric policy was implemented, productivity and industrial development were put before any argument that sought to preserve those natural monuments, such as rivers and waterfalls, that could be used for electricity production. The celebratory record of the ability of the Chilean state to produce electricity by using the wonders of nature was a non-partisan consensus through the second half of the 20th century and can be found in the discourse of both liberal and Christian democratic governments, in the democratic Marxist government of President Salvador Allende, and in the Augusto Pinochet military dictatorship. For all these governments, the country's productivity required the hydraulic force of the rivers, and the transformation of the natural sublime into a technological sublime was not questioned. In fact, it was promoted by images developed by the national electric company, Endesa, by legislators from across the political spectrum, and by the journalistic and photographic records associated with the construction of these infrastructures. The case of Pemmican is paradigmatic because it was the first of this kind, but the fact is that several other hydroelectric plants built in Araucanía, Guaymapu, and Patagonia follow in its path. The understanding of natural wonders as tourism assets and the appreciation of the natural sublime linked to the untamed landscape of southern Chile were unable to hold back the drive toward industrialization and technological development as the only way of achieving the long-sought modernization of Chile in an always precarious material environment. As we can observe in the visual culture promoting industrial projects, in the press, and in the dominant discourses used by all governments during this period, the hydroelectric plants built in southern Chile were a matter of national pride, even though this implied transforming nature. The transformation of nature and the devastation of certain landscape were not considered to be a problem. Since the mid-1990s, the Chilean state had been engaged in a major conflict with the Mapuche communities in Araucanía, Guaymapu, and northern Patagonia. This conflict has its origin in the mid-19th century, when the Chilean army invaded Mapuche territory. The national government promoted the settlement of colonies from Germany and elsewhere to populate a territory that, since the time of the Spanish conquest, had never been dominated by Western powers. Spanish conquerors were expulsed at the beginning of the 17th century from this area. The founding of Chilean cities, the expansion of the railroads into the south, the resettlement of the Mapuche in the small community and the redistribution of their ancestral lands to new owners all contribute to this conflict, which remained dormant through much of the 20th century, but which re-emerged in the 1990s thanks to three causes. One, the debate opened by the end of the Pinochet dictatorship. The second time, the rise of a global discourse on environmental conservation and the construction, in the third place, the construction of a hydroelectric mega project on ancestral Mapuche lands. In 1994, the National Electric Company announced a plan to build 2 hydroelectric dams on the Biobío River, one of the largest rivers in the country, which will increase the country's energy capacity by nearly 20%. The Ralco and Pangue hydroelectric plants will be built in a forest part of the Andes and will require the creation of 2 reservoirs that will occupy some 1,000 hectares of land. These reservoirs will not only require the relocation of a group of Mapuche peasants, but will also flood forests of Araucaria, trees considered sacred by the Mapuche, as well as an ancestral cemetery. This situation led to a local political conflict between the par-state enterprise and the affected community, the latter led by Machi Nicolasa Quintreman, her leader, who will take the case to Chile's environment courts created in 1993, as well as ordinary courts. The initial rulings were in favor of the Mapuche community, but these were later reversed by the Chilean Supreme Court, and the infrastructure projects were complete in the beginning of the 2000s. After the project has been complete, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights ruled in favor of Mapuche community. The Ralco power plant is one of the most important in Chile, capable of generating up to 700 megawatts of electricity. Its reinforced concrete dam is the largest that has ever been built in Chile and is one of the largest in South America, at 300 meters across and 100 meters high. The net drop is 200 meters. It is capable of feeding up to 6,700 cubic meters of water per second into its 2 vertical Alstom turbines. There is no question that this is an infrastructure project that subverts the way of understanding the natural sublime in southern Chile in favor of a new technological sublime that provokes similar experience of terror as that of approaching the edge of a cliff or of the crater of a volcano. The opening of the floodgates of the Ralco power plant generates a 100-meter mechanical waterfall, the sight and noise of which are just as impressive as those of a natural waterfall. But beyond the dimension of this work of engineering, the place occupied by the debate on its construction must be determined in terms of the understanding of pristine nature as a monument opposed to those based on the new technologies of the 20th century. In an article published in Le Monde Diplomatique at the beginning of 2000, the journalist Jaime Mazardo explained the surprising modernity of the struggle of Mapuche people in defending their territory from the depredation of lodgers and electric companies. In effect, the struggle to stop the megadam led by Nicolasa Quintreman and her community constitute the first important political environment conflict in Chilean history. This conflict is perhaps the clearest testimony of how struggles of small territory can have a global impact. The Mapuche were not only defending their territory and their autonomy under a democratic regime, but also their culture, inherent ecological balance. 15 years before, climate change became a pressing issue. In 2013, their fight lost against Endesa, now privatized and under Spanish ownership, Nicolasa Quintreman was found dead, floating in the artificial reservoir. The police ruled it to be an accident or possible a suicide. Her death also symbolized the defeat of her struggle, which has nevertheless inspired other conservation movements that have elevated certain natural objects to the level of monuments. To conclude this presentation, I would like to briefly mention the way in which other environment conflicts sparked by megadams in Chile and Patagonia have been resolved in recent years. The most important case is Hydroelectric, a project that would have involved the construction of 7 dams on the Baker River in a sparsely populated region of Chile far south. This project's goal was to provide power for the large mining companies operating in the Atacama Desert, in the country's extreme north. The plan would have involved not only the flooding of valleys, but that are practically untouched by the hand of man, but also the construction of a great electricity highway that will cross Chile and Patagonia from south to north, with 500 kilometers of transmission towers, nearly 300 meters in height, which will destroy the region's unique site. The Ralco experience of the 1990s and the struggle of the Mapuche people laid the foundation of a social movement that brought together indigenous communities, anti-globalization leftist groups, and liberal ecologists, who took up the banner of protecting the natural heritage of rivers such as the Baker, which they consider to be natural monuments. A well-planned media campaign, along with protests of thousands of people in Chile's major cities, proved to be the political pressure needed for the administration of President Sebastián Piñera to end the project in 2013. At the end of the second presidency of Michelle Bachelet in 2018, a new national park was founded in Patagonia with a surface area of over 1 million hectares, including lands donated by the American philanthropist Douglas Tompkins and the Chilean state. This legally protects a large part of Chilean Patagonia from the construction of energy infrastructure. It starts a new deal between Chilean and environment in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rodrigo. And now I'm going to introduce Karl Schlögel. Karl Schlögel is an emeritus professor at the European University Viadrina in Frankfurt on the Oder River at the German-Polish border. Karl is also a writer. He studied sociology, philosophy, East European history, and Slavic languages at the Free University in Berlin and the State University in Moscow. Karl wrote his PhD dissertation about working-class resistance in post-Stalinist Russia. After finishing his studies, he worked as a freelance writer for German newspapers and as a translator. In 1990, he got the chair for East European history at the University of Constance, Lake of Constance. In 1995, he moved to the Viadrina University, founded after the reunification of Germany, where he taught up until 2013. There, he served also as a dean of the Faculty for Cultural Studies. His research and writings are focused on Russia and the Soviet Union, the urban culture of East Central Europe, forced migration in the 20th century, and the history of the Russian diaspora. He had visiting scholarships in Oxford, Budapest, Uppsala, Munich, Vienna, Berlin, and the Getty Research Institute. Among his publications are Read in Moscow, Petersburg, Laboratory of Modernity, Promenade in Yalta, Russian Berlin, Capital in an Age of Extremes, Moscow 1937, Ukraine, a Nation on the Borderlands, The Soviet Century, Archaeology of a Vanished World, and To Read Time in Space. His book, Soviet Century, will come out at the end of 2019 with Princeton University Press. A book on Channel Number 5 in Red Moscow will come out next year. He has got a number of awards, and he has elected last year as a member of the German Academy of Language and Literature and the Orden pour le Mérite, founded by Alexander von Humboldt. Please welcome Karl Schlögel.
Thank you very much, Cristobal, for your kind introduction. Thank you very much for this invitation to be back at the Getty, which is an unbelievable place, and I have to say it had already some kind of impact, because for me, working for years and decades on Eastern Europe and Russia, I'm going now westward, and I'm going to have a project about the United States viewed from the East. But it's not a Russian collusion, I have to say. It's just another perspective, not Tocqueville, not Max Weber, but looking from the East to the US. As someone born in post-war and Cold War Germany in the second half of the 20th century, I grew up in an intellectual environment where monumentality or monumentalism was identified with power, absolute power, and even more precisely with totalitarian power. Educated and trained in the universities of the 60s and 70s, there was no way out of the respective discourses of totalitarianism or anti-totalitarianism, especially in West Germany. The imagination of the post-Nazi generation was abundant with images of monumentality emerging from the Nazi past. The design of Albert Speer's capital Germania, that is Berlin, in the language of the Nazis, included a great hall of the people over 300 meters high, meant for conventions of 100,000 people. And while the structure was never built, it left its traces, which you can find everywhere in the center of Berlin today. But I was socialized not only in West Germany or West Berlin, but also later on in the Soviet Union. And again, a relationship between power, total power, and monumentality, for example, I observed when I discovered the project for the Palace of the Soviets by Boris Yofan and Vladimir Gelfreich, or when I was strolling through the city reading the skyscrapers of the late 1940s in Stalin's high or imperial style. The identity, or at least affinity, of totalitarianism and totalitarian art was convincingly demonstrated by these two pavilions of the Third Reich and the USSR on the International Fair in Paris 1937, designed by Speer and Yofan. I'm relating to this experience because the discourse on monumentality has a history, and this is again the pavilions in Paris. I'm relating this experience because the discourse on monumentality has a prehistory. We are not the first ones to consider it, and I have had to find my own way of rethinking this tradition. Of course, since the late 1970s, there has been a lot of new research and reconceptualization of the total power, moving from ideology to history and developing the ideas of Hannah Arendt on the basis of new so-called revisionist historiography in the school of Sheila Fitzpatrick and others. But this was not an easy way or linear road, as you can see from publications about Soviet iconography of power by Victoria Bonnell or totalitarian art by Igor Golomstok, not to forget Stalin's Gesamtkunstwerk by Boris Groys. I also want to recall the many exhibitions, including the Beauty of Power in Vienna at the MAC, or the exhibition Europe of the Dictatorships organized by the European Council after the fall of the Iron Curtain. Our discourse, or at least my discourse, has been framed over a long time and formed by a venerable intellectual tradition. At the same time, I have had my own experience with monumentality, and this is the point of departure for my talk today. I have to admit that I have been fascinated by monumental structures from the very first encounter, and two of the most impressive examples of this experience were the dams I'm going to talk about now: the Hoover Dam on the Colorado River and the Dnipro-Gez Dam on the Dnipro River. Both I visited for the first time in the 1980s and again since then, and you can make a 5-hour drive to go to the Hoover from Getty. Talking about the Hoover and Dnipro-Gez dams means to understand that there are forms of monumentality which do not need apologies or legitimation. There is monumentality without monuments. I took this phrase from the exhibition here. Rather, to talk about Hoover and Dnipro-Gez is to talk about the ingenuity of engineers, and even beyond that, to pay homage to a human genius and its capacity to master nature and society. Also, to which degree we will see at the end. It is necessary to give a definition of monumentality. It is not so much about, if it is necessary, it's not so much about monuments, but about proportions, about hierarchy, about the relations between object and subject. It has to do with the relations between human and superhuman proportions, the sublime in Immanuel Kant's terminology, or in Nikolai Gogol's version, man-made structures which make the human observer or visitor small and humble, provoking feelings of submission and oppression, not inspiration. This is my view, and for my very limited analytical purpose, is it quite sufficient. In the following, I will start with the beauty of monumentality. Second, I will address the machine in the garden and provide some basic information about the Hoover Dam and Dnipro-Gez. Third, the monuments of different modernities. The beauty of monumentality. Monuments are, as any other artifacts and objects of material culture, documents sui generis. You can read them as materialistische Physiognomiker, as Walter Benjamin would have called it, materialist physiognomy, as multi-layered documents, palimpsests. I have tried to develop this phenomenological approach systematically in my book, To Read Time and Space. That means you have to start with the surface, with the appearance, with the phenomenon. In the case of the Hoover Dam, you have a chance to view it from the airplane crossing the Great Desert, the Colorado River, and the Black Canyon with Lake Mead. From this bird's eye view, you can grasp immediately the ingenuity of the site. The narrowest canyon, the high walls of the Rocky Canyon, the dam storing the water of the river more than 160 miles long. Close to this site, you can even see Boulder City, the instant city built for the workers on the construction site. You can see the new bridge connecting Nevada and Arizona, two of the states that took part in the Colorado Contract of 1930. You will fly over cities which exist only on the basis of the water and electricity delivered from the Colorado River, Las Vegas, and Los Angeles. Looking at the dam, you understand immediately that the dam is situated precisely, a clip, a wedge, a clasp, inserted by human hands at the most suitable site, using and pressing the water into the pipes of the power station and moving the turbines. No less impressive is the view the visitor has on the spot. Standing on the crest of the Arc Gravity Dam, you look downward to the ground of the canyon, scanning a concrete structure almost 1,000 feet high, following an elegant and smooth curvature, looking upstream toward the lake and the intake towers, or downstream towards the spillover pipes. If you have time to enter the power station housing the giant turbines, you sense the flow of the water inside the pipes. You are inside a huge man-made machine, walking through lighted corridors carved out of the rock face, stopping at the visitor center of the Bureau of Reclamation with fascinating newsreels and documents that tell the story of the structure. Of course, as a scholar, I do not trust only my impressions or eyes. I also carry libraries in my head telling me the story behind all this. But I will start with the impression. No. Now first about Dnieproges, which I have known for a long time since Georgy Petrusov's poster, USSR in Construction. This one. Walking over the crest, the elegance and grandness of the famous dam seems to be far away. I had no chance to see it from above. Flying over would tell you that Dnieproges is a dam across a river, running through flatland, through a plain, but connecting the banks of the river at a site where it is very narrow and where the rapids are now invisible, since the dam has stopped the natural flow of the river. You walk on a sidewalk with the uproaring noise of the trucks and trams on the right, and on the left, the curving pillars of the dam, 60 meters high. The dam links two parts of the city of Zaporozhye, the old industrial town on the left bank and the residential prefabricated neighborhood on the right bank. A dam between heavy industry and domestic residences. Part of the dam is a huge lock which connects the river up and downstream and makes the Dnieper River navigable from the Black Sea to Kiev and further to the Valdai Hills and to the Baltic Sea. Downstream, you can see the island of Khortytsa, which was the center of the famous Cossack hetmanate, and which has become, since the end of the Soviet Union, a site of Ukrainian national heritage with open-air museums, folklore, etc. At the end of the dam, on the right bank, you see a powerhouse structure of glass and red sandstone, a masterpiece of constructivism by the Vesnin brothers. Dnieproges made the river navigable, and the storage reservoir helps to irrigate the steppe first of all. It also delivers electricity to the industrial region of the Donbass, in the Russian Empire the most important, and likewise in the Soviet Union the central place of industrialization. Also now in a region which has suffered from deindustrialization and degradation since the Russian aggression against Ukraine. But what you can see today is not the original version of the dam built between 1927 and 1933. Dnieproges has been blown up in the first weeks of German aggression against the Soviet Union. First by special task forces of the NKVD, before it was reconstructed for a short time period by German occupation forces and engineers, who will then blow up the dam a second time when they were forced to withdraw from the Dnieper in 1943. The destruction of the dam implied the death of thousands of civilians and soldiers of the Red Army located in the valley of the river. But even so the geometrical features of the dam have slightly changed, it has still the power and elegance of a great masterpiece, demonstrating the capacity of man for taming the river, more generally nature. Overwhelming, compelling, astounding. In trying to articulate my personal impression, I sound similar to contemporary visitors of the original construction sites of the dam. For instance, in 1935, a journalist, Theodore Wright, wrote in Harper's Magazine about the Hoover Dam, quote, "It is a beautiful, tantalizing thing. It is complex. It has meaning, not to be grasped in weeks or perhaps years. I stay on fascinated. I stare at the thing, trying to comprehend it, to fix it forever in my mind's eye. I have been inspired and provoked in the weeks I have tried to know it. And now the minds that invented it, the bodies that are building it, the complexity and spirit of it, the love of it, which men feel, all of it bewilders me. And similar quotes you can find from other journalists and writers like Paul Schäffer, who wrote for the Berliner Tageblatt, but the quote I will skip. It is quite clear that these pictures were very important for all eyewitnesses of the construction, and I have to remember only to the great American photographer Margaret Bourke-White and the poster of Georgy Petrusov. They have made the Dnipro-GAZ an icon, and they have made an iconic picture of what the builders of the dam already have succeeded to create. Now I come to my second point, the machine in the garden. One of the most eye-opening readings I had following the early advice of Wolfgang Schiebelbusch was Leo Mark's Machine in the Garden, Technology and the Pastoral Idea in America in the 60s. But I find it fits not only for the paintings of the Hudson School. I consider the machine in the garden more generally in terms of man-made objects, artifacts of some size and magnitude, which have the capacity to transform the entire environment. I could call them also emblematic objects, lieux de mémoire, as Pierre Noir has called it, iconic and symbolic places. In that sense, the Golden Gate Bridge of 1937, designed by Joseph Strauss in 1937, or the Brooklyn Bridge, designed by John Roebling, 1883, are, for me, machines in the garden. In my view, the Hoover Dam and Dnipro-GAZ are machines in the garden, or in Louis Mumford's terminology, mega machines. And I could mention many more, the landscape of metallurgical plants in Gary, Indiana, or Magnitogorsk in the Urals. In general, all structures and systems able to transform space into territory, producing density and integration or disruption on a great scale. Now, some information about Hoover and Dnipro-GAZ, which you can find en masse and en détail in YouTube, etc. Both projects were realized in the 1930s. Dnipro-GAZ was built between 27 and 32. Hoover between 1931 and 36. Both have been part of great projects, the first 5-year plan of industrialization and collectivization of the USSR, and during the New Deal of the Roosevelt era. Dnipro-GAZ was at its time the largest dam and power station in Europe. Both were multi-purpose projects. In the case of Dnipro-GAZ, to make the river navigable, produce electricity, serve the industrialization of the region, and irrigate the steppe. In the case of Hoover Dam, to ensure flood control after devastating floods in 1904 and 6, to change the riverbed of the Colorado River, to irrigate the new Southwest and above all California by providing water management for the cities of Los Angeles and Las Vegas. Both the American and Soviet project have a prehistory. The dam was not the idea of Gosplan, the state planning commission of the Soviet Union or Stalin himself, and nor was it the idea of F.D. Roosevelt or the brain trusts of the New Deal. It is true that the crisis of the new economic policy in the USSR at the end of the 20s and the Great Depression in 1929 in the US accelerated the process of decision-making. But the basic idea was born in the late 19th century when regionalists and engineers were making first drafts for the integration and development of recently acquired territories. The Southwest in the US, or priming the economic engine of Tsarist Russia in the Donbass. These projects date from the 1890s up to the 1920s. The names of these pioneers are almost forgotten today. In the Soviet case, a number of bourgeois experts worked for the Soviet government, which took the initiative to put into practice what the Tsarist government already had projected, the electrification of the country. Lenin's motto was communism, that is Soviet power plus electrification. The engineers and experts who designed and made the dams received the education and planning practice in pre-war US and Russia. And it is more than symbolic that the general consultant of the Dnieper Dam was an experienced engineer, Colonel Hughes Cooper, who had already built dams on the Mississippi and Missouri, while the director of the construction site of the Dnieper was Ivan Alexandrov, a world-class engineer who got his education in pre-revolutionary Russia and Europe and had traveled to the US in the 20s. So you may call it the realization of projects of a generation, taking up the challenges of their countries and the deep crises of the late 20s. We know much more about the details of the construction process of the Colorado than on the Dnieper. Ivan Alexandrov had to find an entirely different site for the Dnieper. The technology was quite simple, not to say primitive, to produce concrete and to make the scaffolding, but the American engineers were amazed by the capacity of unqualified labor to cope with these technological challenges. Now, there are some photos from the construction site showing the Dnieper. Thousands of workers, peasants from the countryside, had to be trained, and the main problem was how to get qualified people. Part of the project was the design of a new town, Alexandrovka, renamed in Zaporozhye, including barracks, sport facilities, schools, cultural palaces. But this was only for a small portion of workers moving to the construction site from the surrounding villages, where in these years, and we should remember this, the Great Famine had raged. Finally, with millions of deaths in the countryside of the Ukraine. Finally, the dam stretched about 1,000 meters with a power station, 9 turbines delivered by Westinghouse and General Electric. The American experts were housed in a special settlement called Americanka, with all the amenities of American life, including newspapers and food delivered via the port of Odessa. The inauguration of the dam and power station took place on 7th November 1932, the anniversary of the revolution, by illuminating the dam with the name of Lenin. The dark and unknown side of the Dnieper success story is that we do not know how many people suffered and died on the construction site due to accidents, suicide, health problems. Also, we know quite accurately that the Hoover Dam claimed 101 victims. There is even a memorial today on the site for these victims and even for the dog, which played an important role for the workers. What about the Hoover Dam? The challenge was a different one in terms of organization and engineering. There was no central state planning organization like Gosplan or Goelro in the Soviet Union. You had to find and to bring into cooperation a number of actors, private organizations, companies, states, which would be able to carry on the burden of making the contracts, financing, organizing, and building the structure. The idea of taming the Colorado was not new, as I have already told. The main actors were the Bureau of Reclamation, the federal government, the participating states along the river, and the 6 companies. There were rivaling interests between the states. Arizona wrestled with California concerning the volume of water derived for irrigation on both sides. There were competing interests of the big cities for water once the LA area was connected via the Colorado aqueduct. There were the rival interests of the agricultural complex. And last but not least, the competition between the companies for the greatest benefits and most profitable commissions in construction, machinery, supplies, and other areas. But finally, with these debates settled, the engineers could step into a series of enterprises: exploration on the grounds, experimentation with the quality of concrete, and new ways of drilling the deviation tunnels, laying the rails over the canyon, building factories close to the construction site, connecting the site with the railway system, erecting towers for the bridges over the canyon. All these steps were well documented and visible for visitors moving to the construction site to watch for the adventure of construction. It was especially exciting to watch the scalers who did their dangerous job with jackhammers hundreds of meters above the ground and under extreme temperatures in the summertime. A great number of them native people familiar with the rocks, the canyons, the weather. There are many extremely fascinating facts about the Hoover Dam construction, but I will mention only two of them. First, the idea of the deviation tunnel dug in order to clean the riverbed for construction, together with 4 tunnels of 15 meters diameter and 5 kilometers in length, and to build a coffer dam to stop the flow of the river. Second, the construction of the arch gravity dam as such required the invention of a method in order to cool down the temperature of the concrete, which was achieved by putting cables for cool water to run through the concrete blocks generated in a refrigeration plant built especially for this purpose nearby. So the companies even fulfilled their contracts ahead of time. And it was a great event when President Roosevelt came to the Hoover Dam to give a speech on September 30th, 1935, which was broadcasted nationwide. But the name of the original inventor of the dam, Hoover, was silenced and not mentioned by FDR. FDR echoed Julius Caesar, quote, "This morning I came, I saw, and I was conquered, as everyone would be who sees for the first time great feat of mankind," quote. It is a matter of fact that both dams and power stations, Hoover and Dnieproges, had a huge impact on the physical and social landscape of the New West in the US and the New South in the USSR, also in different ways and sometimes with consequences which were not intended in advance. The control of the rivers, avoiding flooding for the one and making the other one navigable, the peopling of new areas in the New West and the urbanization of the New South, water management for the large cities, the electricity to support new industries, and last but not least, tourism. Lake Mead became a recreation area, and there was also a talk about the New Deal for leisure. Boulder Dam was called the modern oasis of the West. Now I go to my next point, the monuments of different modernities. In both societies, the American and the Soviet, the two structures played an important role in representation of the new, of the modern. And it was Hans Rogger, a professor teaching here in Los Angeles, who coined the term of Soviet Americanism and of American Sovietism. And it was designed to describe an era when both countries were very close in their efforts to modernize and to solve crises. One of the most convincing examples of the tone of Soviet Americanism and American Sovietism of the time is the book Little Golden America, written by two of the most gifted and most popular Soviet writers, Ilya Ilf and Yevgeny Petrov, and the reception of Soviet writings of the time in the United States, including Little Golden America. The strange and remarkable thing is that Ilf and Petrov's book was based on a series of reports they had written for Pravda, the party newspaper, and the journal Aganyok, published in the darkest of all periods of Soviet history, that is, in the years of the Great Terror and the Stalinist purges, but written in order to praise the American way of life in Stalin's Moscow. I have a chapter of this in my book. Ilf and Petrov were traveling across the continent, meeting public intellectuals of the New Deal era, visiting places of the New World, including the electrified kitchen of General Electric, Ford's River Rouge plant, Hollywood, and of course, the Boulder Hoover Dam. As we learned recently, the Soviet writers were guided by one of the most interesting persons on the stage of the US-USSR relations, David Throne. They met engineer Thompson, who received from the Soviet government the Order of the Red Banner as a kind of, quote, world champion of installing colossal electrical machines. Both writers were full of admiration for the masterpiece of American civil engineering, but not too much. They criticized Roosevelt's opening speech because he did not mention the workers who built the dam, quote, the great monument to man's triumph over nature. What I want to say is, and I do not discuss the ongoing controversy over Roosevelt's New Deal, the controversies between Ayn Rand and others, I want to say that there was a kind of transnational common experience, common expectation, common mode of expression and rhetoric. And this is what I want to elaborate a bit more. The outcome being, it was a time of great expectations and making plans for a future often not far from utopia. I will stress the following features. Electrification and enlightenment. It was a commonplace of the late 19th century and early 20th century to identify electrification with enlightenment. Electricity made the darkness of cities disappear, illuminated urban space, opened concert halls and libraries, as well as private households. The inventions of Thomas Alva Edison changed the world from the age of steam to the age of electricity, which ended the dependency on a given physical place, as electricity could be used everywhere and generated new landscapes of manufacturing. Edison lamps were also Lenin's lampochka, bringing light into the huts of Russian peasants. Electricity generated new spaces of progress. In the New Deal era, electricity helped to develop rural landscapes and integrated distant regions, taming the river and conquering the nature or nature as battlefield. Engineers, planners, businessmen, as well as statesmen thought about controlling the wild waters of the rivers and to correct the irrational way of rivers in order to use them for human purposes. Rivers had to be corrected, improved, used, and redirected. Taming and correcting rivers was a kind of idée fixe of the age of progress and may be of all historical epochs if we look at the projects of channeling rivers, building canals in the early modern time. Dnieper was a river, this is showing Mr. Cooper, the consultant from the Mississippi and Missouri dams, and on the right side, the Dnieper Dam chaining the waters. Rivers became battlefields of human labor against natural forces, transforming natural riverscapes into technoscapes with all the intended consequences for changing microclimates, the rhythm of reproduction of the fish species, the level of groundwater, the structure of economy along the river. The Dnieper River, made navigable, became a port on the shores of the Black Sea, and Moscow became, as the slogan went, the port of 5 seas. The Mississippi and Missouri rivers were transformed into continental highways for ships from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence River. This idea of fighting against nature is quite clear in Mayakovsky's poem from 1926, Our Debt to the Ukraine. I quote, "Taming the Dnieper with a bundle of wires, they will force the Dnieper to flow across turbines, and the Dnipro, through wire whiskers, will flow through the blocks as electricity." Quote. Next, the heroism of labor, the beauty of human work. Visiting Dnepr and Hoover, you will find some memorials dedicated to the people who worked, who suffered, who created these structures. They are like homage to what human beings can achieve. The first half of the 20th century was the age of a strong working class movement, of the proclamation of the emancipation of the laboring and toiling masses in a global perspective. The worker was the ideal and idealized symbol of a Promethean age. Workers were perceived not only as objects of exploitation and repression, but as creators of a new and more human, even classless society. At the Hoover, it was the qualified worker as well as the master of drilling or the highliners, the scalers with jackhammers who were admired by visitors. You have seen it already. On the Dnieproges side, it was the peasant who made his way as engineer, learning by doing, and very often taking his career to the top of a metallurgical combinat, from peasant to red director. There was a lot of propaganda, but a lot of social reality too. There were strikes on the Hoover Dam in August 1931. New York Times magazine regarded this construction as the pioneering the machine age, 24 hours a day, with the site illuminated at night, a set of dinosaur-like cranes, shovels, draglines, caterpillars, tractors, jumbo drilling rigs, and cableways, a real choreography of the modern. Now, new cities for the new man, mastering nature, mastering space, gardening the desert. The dams became hubs, enhancing migration movements from villages to the cities now emerging, and from the Old West to the New West, creating new landscapes, new cities and places where, without water and electricity, human or urban life would have been impossible. The rising number of inhabitants in short periods of time and the growing urban agglomeration are the most visible indicators, designed by urban planners as both provisional and provisional and permanent cities, like Boulder City. Now, the generation of power. Anne Rusweiler, in her study about electrification and especially about Dnieproges, called the men and women who created the dam the generation of power. She had in mind, first of all, the younger generation, the enthusiasts and communists, leaving the villages and making careers in the cities and on the sites of communist construction. This is obvious. But I would say there are, in fact, two elements or segments of the generation of power. The older one, which was prepared and educated long before the first 5-year plan of the Stalin time, and the younger one. It is the combined power of two generations who created Hoover Dam and Dnieproges. One could mention the commander of the 6 companies, the main engineer, the experts of the Bureau of Reclamation, the brain trust people of New Deal, all together and combined represent the intellectual and practical coalition behind these wonders of the world. The same goes, and even more so, for the Soviet Union, with old imperial patriotic experts and the newcomers, the so-called Vydviženci, representing the unprecedented social upward mobility of the 1930s. For them, everything seemed possible. Their slogan was, "Yes, we can." On these pictures are the engineers, Winter Alexandrov, and the architect, Viktor Vesnin. And these are the American counterparts, Frank Karl and Cooper, together with his Soviet colleague, Winter. The combination of scientific and social engineering generated the power to create these structures. It was an obvious coincidence or simultaneity of men, women, and ideas. People like Frank T. Crow, engineer, inventor, man of action with 5,000 men under his direction, or the managers of the 6 companies, or on the Soviet side, engineers and architects. Now I come to the point, Gesamtkunstwerk, thinking totality, struggling for form. But in many ways, the Hoover Dam and Dnieproges were the experiment for even greater project that followed after World War II was over, such as the great Stalinist plan of the transformation of nature of 1948 and the Tennessee Valley project, Tennessee Valley Authority project, conceived at the beginning of the New Deal for the modernization of the American Southeast. We cannot discuss them here, and neither have been realized entirely, but in fragments they are still visible and in function. Both included building a number of dams and power stations, electrifying large regions, establishing new settlements and industries, as well as irrigating and canal building. Also, in comparing both of them, it is quite clear that Stalin's plan, praised everywhere in the Soviet-occupied Eastern Europe of the 1940s, was much more ambitious than TVA. It should be clear that both projects revealed fundamental differences in, for instance, the use of labor. That means of forced labor in the Soviet Union. All these canals have been constructed on the basis of the use of forced labor in the Gulag. Some elements of the Stalin plan, such as the redirection of the northern rivers to the south, provoked the first environmental protest in the Soviet Union, initially inside the institutes of the Academy of Science, and later among a wider audience of social movements. Returning to Hoover and Dnepro-Gez, the idea and ambition of creating a Gesamtkunstwerk became clear when we look at the aesthetic dimension. In both cases, there was a struggle over the form the structures should have. Neither dam would have become a wonder of the 20th century if this had not been the case. Form and design were not just the result of the technical function, but the result of artistic will. This was clear to all participants, especially the artists who worked with the effects of black-white photography, like Ben Glaha, the official photographer of the Bureau of Reclamation, or Margaret Bourke-White, who used their contrasts for her American and Soviet photo and film projects, and most of all for the great artists of American modernity, like George Schiller. On the left side, Schiller, and in between the plan and the crest of the dam. Design and form were the result of decision, even of struggles between different and sometimes rivaling aesthetic conceptions. This is quite clear in the Soviet case, represented by the architect Viktor Vesnin, but also in the American case, represented by the architect Gordon Kaufmann. Vesnin here on the right side. Viktor Alexandrovich Vesnin was responsible for the design and construction of the power station and the turbine hall on the western side of the dam. But what he says about the shape of the turbine halls holds good for the entire project. He summed it up in 1932, quote, "In Dnepro-Gez we achieved the maximum synthesis of functionality and beauty. We found the most powerful architectural expression for the technical idea embodied in Dnieprostroy by erecting a building whose beauty did not consist of stucco ornaments or rows of columns. We have used materials such as glass tiles, etc., to a hitherto unknown degree. Because of that, we could draw the walls apart and achieve an unprecedented spaciousness in the building whose height did not exceed 20 meters and in length 250 meters, quote end. Victor Vesnin's colleagues were Nikolai Colli, a partner of Le Corbusier, and his assistant Georgy Orlov. The decision in favor of his union of form and function was not self-evident, as can be seen from the public controversies that raged around the project. And in the course of the discussion with Anatoly Lunacharsky, one of the intellectuals among the leaders of the party, Viktor Vesnin explained, quote, "I belong to the school of thought that does not believe it is possible to make a sharp distinction between the architect's and the engineer's contribution to a building. In any given case, the form of the building is only a consequence, and if we work on the form, it is only in the sense of giving a greater precision and a greater perfection in our treatment of the data laid out for us by the fundamental functional decision. So I come now to the end but first now about the Hoover Dam. The dam impresses as a physical entity that captures the imagination. Gordon Kaufmann was not merely following the demands of engineers as a functionalist, but he converted, as Richard Wilson stated, he converted the dam's design for a banal, warmed-over classicism to a realm of modernism. His modernist vocabulary not only respected the engineer's technological demands, but it also enhanced them. He simplified and modernized the various parts of the dam. On the crest, the overhanging balcony and 4 unequal towers gave way to a series of observation niches and towers that rise from the wall and continue upward. Quote end. Gordon Kaufmann, he is in Los Angeles well known as the designer of the Los Angeles Times building, and Richard Neutra had worked for him shortly in the 20s. He himself, Kaufmann wrote, quote, "There was never any desire or attempt to create an architectural effect or style, but rather to take each problem and integrate it to the whole in order to secure a system of plane surfaces relieved by shadows here and there where the plan or requirements suggested." And he was thinking even about coloring the dam. Kaufmann was also responsible for the design of the turbine hall, the tinted roofs, this is the Los Angeles Times building, for the turbine hall, the tinted roofs and the ornaments of the intake towers and many other parts, and he cooperated with artists in this spirit. With Oscar G. Hansen, designed the entrances of the elevator towers, the monument with the winged figures, and the Great Seal of the United States of the Nevada side of the dam. And Alan True from Denver designed the lobbies with floors of dark green and black marble, white stucco, and aluminum ceilings. Most remarkable are the reliefs with motifs of the local Indian people. Now I come to my end. The Rhetorics of Progress, Different Modernities. I have tried to show how striking the correspondences between both projects were in perception, function, spirit, design. But at the same time, the differences are striking too. Different ways of coping with a fundamental crisis, different methods in an open society and in a system of almost unlimited, unleashed power. Many actors here, one main actor there, and the basic difference, the economic and social backwardness of Holy Russia end of the 20s and the highly developed and wealthy United States shaken by the Great Depression and its consequences. Dnieproges is situated in a landscape of unprecedented disasters, devastated by war, revolution, and civil war, and finally by the millions of victims of collectivization and the Great Famine 1929-32. Hoover Dam stands for a different way of solving social crises in the form of the many elements of Roosevelt's New Deal. War did not come to the Hoover Dam, except for the period when the dam was closed to tourists after Pearl Harbor and sometime after 9/11. Dnieproges was blown up twice and is now still one of the greatest hydroelectric power plants on Earth, but outside and beyond the Soviet Union, a state which does not exist anymore. We, 2 generations later, looking back, know about the shortcomings of the great achievements of the 20th century, the dark sides of the mega machines and the negative effect machines in the garden may have. But I will not hesitate to admit that Hoover Dam and Dnieproges are 2 of the greatest monuments the human genius has created in an otherwise dark century, which has been called rightfully the age of extremes. I thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Rodrigo and Karl. And it seems like we are going to keep elaborating thoughts about monumentality as stability, monumentality as durability, permanence and transformation. So I have a first question, and in both presentations, I think that the role of media is extremely key. Wondering if you can consider that we also can understand monumentality as the wide dissemination in media of these projects. I mean, I'm talking about all the propaganda that also creates the political importance of these massive works.
Well, yeah, I think it's. I think all these kind of monuments are media or mediatic, I don't know, monuments, because of the importance or the high dimension of the monuments, but also, of course, media has an important role to show this kind of great project. In Chilean case, well, both nature and technological monuments were, well, they occupy an important place in media, in propaganda, in media as in a touristic way of seeing media, and also in propaganda as a political issue, of course.
Publicity and propaganda.
Yeah.
Publicity in terms of commercial purposes and propaganda because it has also political goals.
Yeah, yeah. It was important in both senses, I think. Well, of course, media are part of our sources too.
Yeah.
It's so important, even if we work in archives, of course, media and the way of well, showing how the state is working in the construction of this kind of infrastructure. Of course, media is part of well, a system of sources that we are using. Also, this kind of images, for example. I showed some images made by one of the most important photographers that work for the Corfo, it's the National Corporation of Development. Okay. And he was part of I didn't talk about him, but he was part of this media system. He worked as a professional in this area.
Yeah. Karl?
Yeah. I have a problem to call these structures monuments. They are structures of civil engineering, and they are becoming monuments in our mind, in our perception. They are created as works of the technological sublime, which is a wonderful expression. But I would like first to insist on the fact that they are in the second row, or in the second stage, objects of propaganda. They are, first of all, they are monuments or works of creating new conditions of life, transforming the environment. And I mean, I understand completely the very critical assessment you gave of the dam constructions in Chile, and I feel like a kind of apologist of the sublime, of the technological sublime. But I would say it is a great achievement to build these kind of structures who transformed the landscape in the sense that progress, I mean progress in quotation marks or not, has developed. There would not be an industrialization of the South, or the Soviet Union. And I know, I mean, I'm also writing a book on the Volga River, the cascade of 19 dams. And I know about the disastrous consequences. And we even don't know what will happen to these dams when they are falling apart, which is quite possible. And the Dnieproges Dam is, in this moment I read in the internet, is closed because the vibrations of the freight cars crossing the dam are somehow dangerous for the stability of the dam. So I know about the consequences, the non-intended consequences of these structures. But I have, first of all, I have to say, to make a decision to build this Hoover Dam or Dnieproges, it was a decision for developing desert. I mean, I know also about the victims. I mean, the victims in the Hoover Dam are only on the surface of the design of True in the Indian mosaic. Yeah? They disappeared entirely, or they were working as high lifters on the rocks. But I know about the victims, I know about these consequences, but there would be no Los Angeles, there would be no San Diego, there would be no Las Vegas without these transforming of a riverscape into a technoscape. And the first element and motivation for taming the Colorado was the flood in pre-First World War time. Several floods where the Colorado River changed the riverbed and moved into Imperial Valley. So I don't know. I had not to make the decision to build or not. I can describe the effects, and but I have first to say I'm impressed by the work which has done, which has been used afterwards by propaganda or by this great woman, Margaret Bourke-White. She was a great photographer, I mean, looking all her things. But for instance, she did not see, she was on the site in Ukraine. She did not have one photo about the victims of the Great Famine. Yeah?
I think we have a question from Elizabeth.
Hi, thank you both for two great talks. My question is actually about the origin of this idea of the sublime in the way that you're using it as the technological sublime. I think if we are thinking back to yesterday's talks and this morning's talk, we can trace a kind of continuum from the visual monumentality to a kind of haptic or tactile monumentality, climbing, which is a kind of tactile process, moving mountains literally with your hands. You both talked about things that are very loud, but we didn't hear a lot about sound. And so I'm wondering if there's a kind of soundscape as monumentality and how that factors into the sublime. I think that experiential quality is something that's really obvious when looking at the photographs you both showed, but I'd love to hear you articulate more about how that relates to this idea of monumentality being kind of boiled down to the idea of technology, which in some ways is much more of a sterile notion of what monumentality can be when you experience it.
Yes, that's a very important soundscape of taming the river. I mean, the Hoover Dam, if the water is not going through, and as you know, the surface of the Lake Mead is low now. It does even not work producing electricity. So the vibration, the sound which was inspiring Chile, Bourke-White, and others going in the 30s to Hoover Dam, it's now a silent dam, more or less. A silent dam. And the same is with Dnieproges. Sometimes it's changing and transformed into a kind of waterfall, which has been before. And to the soundscape also belongs, and you can find all these reels in YouTube, these speeches. I mean, if you listen to the speak of Franklin Delano Roosevelt at Hoover, it's an amazing rhetoric, and I would say you cannot understand the spirit of time without listening to Roosevelt's speech on the place. So that's a very interesting question, but we have to write the history of soundscapes. That's like writing the history of smellscapes. It's a different area, but it's very important to, yeah.
Yeah, for me, it's so important, your question too. Well, I'm working in more general aspect in a book that it's question how our ideas of landscape in southern Chile and Patagonia change from the 19th century to the 20th century, from the original idea of sublime to the new idea of beauty. And I'm working, well, of course, with the sources, philosophical sources that describe the idea of sublime as this sensibility with nature, especially with nature in the 19th century, as an approach to the terrorific or to the in general, the terror and the death, in opposition with these ideas that in the 20th century change to the ideas of beauty that are more connected with pleasure, for example, and love. In my case, or specifically in the cases of waterfalls and dams, for example, the idea of sublime is very well connected with this incredible sound that produce the natural waters and also this artificial cascade or waterfall. And I think it's all connected with the experience of a spectator, of course. The observer is the subject of the feelings over these aesthetic qualities of the landscape, the natural landscape, which doesn't exist really, and this new technological landscape. And my own experience in the machinery houses with turbines, for example, was really, sublime, I think. I feel the experience of the sublime in these places because, it was, you have to completely protect to be in the turbine, close to the turbine working because the noise is extreme. And also in the cascade, if you are in the waterfall, sorry, change languages. In the waterfalls, if you are close to a waterfall, you feel the same experience, closer to the death because of the power of the water. So I use these ideas of sublime that came from the philosophy of 18th and 19th century to understand the experience of the people who were in the south, in Patagonia and Araucania in the 19th century or the first decade of 20th century too.
Okay, we have time for two more brief questions.
I also have a question on the technological sublime. I mean, you described, Karl, two things. One, this wonderful sentence from Roosevelt, I came, I see, and I was conquered. I was conquered. So he is the onlooker, he is the spectator of something, and so he can make the experience of the sublime. Then the other phrase was the generation of power. That also has to do with, for instance, what Trotsky says about the link between Nietzsche's Overman and the new Soviet man. But this is not an onlooker or observer, but the man in charge, the master. And interestingly, and that's my problem with the technological sublime, maybe a question to both of you, interestingly, the whole aesthetics of sublime has to do with the observer, the onlooker. They have the experience of the sublime. Whereas when you are in charge, when you are the maker, when you are the producer, you feel this endless power, and this is something different from what traditional aesthetics describe as a sublime. So either we have to have a new theory of the sublime in order to, encompass the master of ceremonies, or there's something wrong with the notion. Maybe I'm misled.
Yeah, that's a good question. That is the sublime produced by the subject, the observer, the visitor. I would say somebody who has hardly worked on these rocky canyons, he has a different perception of the Hoover Dam than the New Deal brain trust arriving in September 35. But I think that the worker who lives in the 30s in Boulder and going every day there, if he is going years after to the Hoover Dam and looking at the power station and the transformed landscape, he will remember his struggling and his suffering, but at the same time, I think he will admire what they and others have created. So he has not the Roosevelt's perspective or a tourist perspective, but I do not think that he can escape the impression, the huge structure which has been created and which existing now. It exists now, will have on him. So I don't need a new theory of the sublime. Yeah.
Rodrigo, you want to say something?
No, I think we are not here constructing a new theory about sublime. I think I'm using the idea of technological sublime as is presented by this author I cite, David Nye, who published a book in the 90s, I think, about the American technological sublime, and he I don't know if he replaced the idea of natural sublime for a new idea of technological sublime, which is centered in infrastructures. I think I'm working with this idea too.
Okay, we have another question from the back, and the last one is going to be by Maristela on the left.
Thank you a lot for these breathtaking talks. I just, since we come back to the origin of this notion of the sublime and the romantic approach, I wanted to remind us all that we didn't talk at all up to now about natural sort of vegetative monuments which existed in a landscape garden of the 18th century, and the landscape garden and the approach to the transformation of natural monuments into a man-made nature of the landscape garden. There we would have many examples in 18th century. And I just wanted to ask you, Karl, about the dams. Since in the early decades of 20th century, there's an approach to these, the engineering of the landscape, which has also a lot to do with a sort of ornamental landscape, a sort of graphic vision of infrastructure in the landscape. So did contemporary photographs also, or mostly, show these dams as a sort of syntax in the landscape, or do they only show the huge wall? And my last question, since we saw earthquake the other day in Scholar Housing, what about the cinematographic history of the dam? That would just interest me, in James Bond or earthquake movies and so on.
I do not know about fiction films, but there is a huge documentation about dams. I mean, you can find newsreels about all stages of constructing the dams, not only Hoover Dam, but on the Columbia River, on the Volga. You can make a week to show these documentary films. I think that the most impressive reproduction of the impression of the sublime is objectivized in the paintings of the great American and, to a certain degree, also Soviet painters and artists. I mean, Charles Sheeler and this school of the precisionists of the machine age. I mean, if you look on their paintings of not only Hoover, but River Rouge plant, of the skyscraper landscape, of and everyday life, I have to say. It's not only about big structures. You have I have the feeling that they were able to find a form to incorporate or to realize or to put into this impression, transform it into paintings. So I would say you have even not to go to the Hoover Dam, you have to look at the photographs and paintings of Sheeler and other people to get an access. Concerning landscaping of gardens, I mean, the greatest gardener, I tried to show this picture of Stalin's plan of the transformation of nature, which was, I mean, it's not monumentalist, it's gigantomanic. I mean, it conceived the entire territory, and it connected rivers from the Black Sea to the Pacific. I mean, unbelievable projects. And in comparison to these Tennessee Valley authorities, quite rational and normal project.
I think we all have several questions to you, but we do not have more time. And well, thank you everybody, and thank you especially to Karl and Rodrigo for your presentations. Thank you.